Wow, what an introduction. I'm sure I can live up to it. So thank you for that, Andy. It's interesting to see on Slido what you really want to be is inspired, you want to gain knowledge, and you want to network. You're at the facility that will allow you to network. I believe my story would inspire you to go back to your own businesses and think differently about how you go about your business and looking after your staff and yourself. As far as knowledge, this 62-year-old head is full of knowledge. I will impart much of it through my presentation. The rest remains in here unless you ask the right questions. So I'm going to ask of you, my ask of you is, think about the questions you would ask someone who has been through what I have been through and recovered from it and went on to lead companies and open new businesses across the world. Someone who is exceptionally passionate about looking after people. There are no questions that are out of bounds. Very personal ones, ones on the night, ones about my career, how I recovered. It's an open book, so I encourage you to think about those questions as we move forward. I'm not going to spend much time introducing myself. Andy did a fantastic job. But what I will tell you is that I am overjoyed to be doing this again because I am at the stage of my career where allegedly I'm semi-retired and I'm giving back to an industry that has been very kind to me. My presentation will be harrowing for you, it will be insightful, and it will be very factual. So with that, I'm going to start with a very short video. And imagine, if you can, being on board this installation. This is footage it was taking of that night on the 6th of July, 1988.
Nimrod 01 to Maritime Rescue.
Maritime Rescue to Nimrod 01. Go ahead, Nimrod.
Overhead Piper Field platform now.
What's the situation?
It's an absolute bloody disaster. Dense smoke and flames. Huge flames.
What's the platform status?
Virtually nothing. Main platform structure not visible above the surface. We estimate flames to be 600 feet high.
Repeat, please, Nimrod.
You heard correctly. Flames estimated at 600 feet. Looks like a really big one.
I believe I will have your attention. Thank you. 225 people just went to work that day. It was just another day. I actually arrived back on board that very morning, myself and some of my colleagues, which I'll talk about later on. Having survived all that and taken time to think about what happened on that evening wasn't an easy and quick task. But I got to thinking as I became a senior leader that what really matters is that you understand this simple phrase, because it applies to everyone in this room and everyone online. Typically, you are free to choose, but you're never free from the consequences of your choices. And those choices may come back to haunt you many, many months, days, or years from when you make that choice. I could tell you that Piper happened as a result of many poorly thought through and bad choices. Choices that were made from the day the Piper field was the first time it was discovered, right up to the day it occurred. And eventually, all those choices reached breaking point. Think of it, a barrier model. The choices made on the day were the last of the barriers to be broken. And that's how Piper Alpha happened. I'll give you some real context around what that looked like. So think about that, and we'll come back to that just shortly. I'm also going to share what I believe is an extremely important set of principles that can be applied to every business, regardless of the sector. I call them my 6 C's. And these 6 C's, if honored and developed, will influence the safety culture at your work site, your organization, and in fact, your global company. They're not intended to be management principles or to replace your management system. They're intended to be a set of ethics that will allow you to run a very safe and efficient business. I'm not going to go through all of these separately. It would take me all day, but I am passionate around them. What is coming up on your screen right now is what good looks like. If you approach those 6 C's with this intent, I guarantee you your business will change. I have seen it happen in many businesses in many parts of the world. It's a lot to think about, and I don't ask that you think about it as a collective group. These are things you should think about periodically, talk to your staff about. Do a sense check in your organization. Do a sense check on yourself. Find out where you are. We're not perfect. We're human. I'll use these 6 C's to demonstrate what went wrong on Piper Alpha on that night. Every one of these was breached, and I'll explain why. Before I get to the meat of my conversation, I want to explain to you that before I got to Piper in 1988, on January 1988, I had spent my early years, 6 years in fact, I think it was, on various different installations. I had worked on about 26 installations, very short-term contracts as a contractor. I was a gypsy, I was a nomad. I didn't belong anywhere, I just did what I did where I went for monetary return, for material things. I really enjoyed the business. It was great. It was a great lifestyle. Yet I wanted to belong somewhere. I wanted to be part of a group. And in 1985, I ended up in a place called North Alwyn. It was brand new, a brand new installation, halfway between Norway and the UK. I was told when I joined it was a short-term contract. But I ended up transferring onto the drilling team, where the message changed. And it was, you could be here for 30 years. But they wouldn't offer me a staff job because they wanted to run it as a contract with short-term agency people. I had to make a decision. I had a child on the way. I had no mortgage. You couldn't get that as a contractor. So I had to find a staff job. And that's how I ended up on Piper. I went to work for a company called Borden Drilling. They transferred me to a place called Beatrice. It was an old installation, but it was a good bunch of guys. Not many. We were tight. We cared for each other. It was a community of care. We would refer to that as psychological safety nowadays, but it was a community of care. What I didn't ask for, it wasn't a choice, was to be transferred to Piper Alpha. Piper Alpha was not known to me, but I can tell you, you can read it here, it was one of the most prolific production platforms in the North Sea. Interestingly enough, the owners of Piper Alpha were Occidental. They were going bankrupt. They had difficult choices to make. They drilled the last well that they could afford in the North Sea, and they found the Piper field. They found that field in 1973. They had struck a gold mine. It would change their world completely. They made some really tough choices, and within 3 years, they were producing oil from Piper. It took them 3 years, only 3 years, to design it, construct it, install it, and put it into production. Piper wasn't all new. Parts of it were taken from somewhere else. It was hobbled together. May I say, not well, cheaply. It was a bit of a mismatch. Enough said. Within 2 years of it being established, it was producing 320,000 barrels of oil every day. It was the most prolific production platform, oil platform in the world. And it was purely producing oil. All the gas that came with it was flared off. They retained none of it. 1978, 79, they made some significant modifications. They actually installed gas compression equipment, something that had never been planned. Think of the choices. The reason they made those choices was because the regulator said to them, you can't flare your gas anymore. You have to pump it ashore. So they had to put on a processing plant for gas into a middle of a already busy installation. There was no room for it. They removed some equipment. They shoehorned it in, right in the center of the platform. If you can imagine installing a gas compression facility in the heart of that platform, how much risk that would take to a platform that was never designed to do it. They also installed additional accommodation modules. Again, a conscious choice. They installed them directly above the gas compression module. Think about a commitment to safety. We'll talk about all of that now. They removed one of the drilling rigs to make space for it. And also, they then started importing gas from neighbouring installations, something it was never designed to do. And that looked a bit like this. Initially, Piper pumped oil into the Shetland Islands, and MCP01 pumped gas from Norway to the UK. No connection to Piper, but as part of the modifications, Claymore and Tartan were now pumping gas into Piper. It became a gas gathering station and an oil and gas production platform. Think about management of change. Think about control of work. Think about commitment to safety. It operated like that for many years. And on the day of the 6th of July, 1988, it was still producing 138,000 barrels of oil. It was also now producing 94 million standard cubic feet of gas. That is a prolific amount of hydrocarbons, all available at source. So I've set the scene. I've talked about 6 C's. I'm going to take you to my last day on Piper Alpha. I arrived at the heliport in Aberdeen early in the morning. I met 16 of my colleagues, my drill crew. I was an electrical technician. We boarded, we landed. After our hour and 20-minute journey, we went down to the accommodation to check in, as you do. There was no safety induction. Piper didn't do safety inductions. If you'd been on before, you didn't need one. Conscious choice. You know the strange thing about not getting a safety induction? None of the 17 of us complained. We were as complicit in the culture on Piper Alpha as the platform was itself. We just accepted that was the way it was. The 2 messages we got on that morning were, if you're on day shift, get your coveralls on, get outside. You've got work to do. And if you're on night shift, get your bed. You'll be up at 6 hours and expected to do a full shift. I was on night shift. That's just the way it was on Piper Alpha. As I prepared to go to my bed, I happened to notice that the flare was burning profusely. They were flaring off more gas than they had in previous trips. And you'd think that would ring an alarm bell. But for me, personally, I chose to do nothing. I chose to do nothing. I didn't think it was my business. It wasn't part of the drilling facility. It was someone else's responsibility. I would come to regret that. Anyway, I went to bed. I got up in the evening. I had my lunch, as I always did. And I went down to the maintenance office. And in that maintenance office was the day shift maintenance crew. Robert McCall, Douglas Glanders, and Sidney McBoyle, my buddies. We had a bit of a laugh. I'd been away for a fortnight. My girlfriend was pregnant. I was the butt of many jokes. It was all good fun. We cared for each other. We had a community of care. And as they prepared to knock off shift, Robert turned to me and said, "Steve, it's your first shift. The rig is running well. There is nothing significant happening on Piper Alpha tonight. You might even get your head down for a couple of hours sleep. I will see you in the morning." I would never see Doug or Sid or Robert again alive. They were about to perish, and none of us had any idea. They knocked off. I went about my business. I did some tours. I went to my maintenance workshop at 9 p.m. I met my night shift crew, David, Ian, and John. It was our first day on. We talked about our time at home. We talked about what we were going to do the next time we went home. And lo and behold, tea break was over. We said goodbye and we arranged to meet at midnight in the galley for our dinner. That would never happen. I would never see David, John alive again. They were about to perish. And again, we had no idea. I went back up onto the drill floor, that white pointy bit. I went about my normal business. And as I stood there, about 15 minutes to 10, something was going wrong and I didn't know what it was. All of a sudden, it dawned on me that something just wasn't right. What we hadn't been told when we came on board, that this was the list of activities that were going on Piper that day. And I don't expect you to understand what they are. They're pretty technical. But let me tell you, they are all significant pieces of work, large pieces of work. In fact, they were so large, we had a flotel alongside with another 150 men who would come on board every day. Imagine what that does to your culture on board. It completely shatters it. All these transient people you don't know the work ethic. We didn't care. We really weren't invested in our own safety. Safe to say that some of those activities would go extremely wrong that night, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. These activities are a typical summer shutdown in an offshore installation, except on Piper, there would be no shutdown. Occidental had decided they would continue to produce oil during the entire summer shutdown project. It was the first time they did it since they produced oil and gas. There was no one on board that had the competence to manage the process. They were short-staffed. Think about a commitment to safety. Think about complacency. Think about control of work. They're all in play. So I'm standing there on the drill floor at approximately 5 to 10 at night. And all of a sudden, there is a huge boom, almost a thud. And this is what it looked like. This is photographs of the first explosion just seconds after. And what I would tell you is, it was only 30 kilograms of gas that caused that explosion. Think about your home barbecues. Think about the gas bottles you keep in your garage. They're probably about 15 kilos, not that much smaller. However, because it was an explosion in a confined space, it created a number of projectiles. Those projectiles broke small bore piping, ruptured plant and vessels, and immediately set fire to the hydrocarbons on board. This is what it looked like. I'm going to go back to the 6 C's because they all led to the first explosion, but they didn't all happen at the same time. Think about commitment. Commitment from management onshore to continue production while doing a summer shutdown and introducing many, many additional sources of ignition, brakes and containment, and a lack of core competence on board. 2, competence. I've mentioned it. On Piper, you weren't taught or trained how to use the permit to work system. You were actually shown by the person you were working with, and you only got to know what they told you. They had a written system. No one followed it. It was a show and tell. And unfortunately, that day, a couple of those tasks were being undertaken by people that had no understanding of how the permit to work system worked. Think about competence. Control of work. On Piper, as a result of the shutdown, they'd shut down the gas compression lines. They had depressured them, they'd done the right things, and one team were recertifying the pressure relief valves, and a completely separate team were planning to do maintenance on the pump on the same line, the same gas line. There was no reference to those 2 tasks on either permit. They were completely separate. Each team had no idea what was going on elsewhere. Complacency. Because the pipe was depressurized, the technician doing the valve work decided when he fitted the blind plates on the pipe, when he took the valve out, to just hand tighten the bolts because there was no pressure in the line. That valve was going back in 4 hours. Why bother torquing it up? Think about complacency. During the shift, they decided that that pump that they were about to work on had to go back online because they assumed that the valve was back in place. The valve had not gone back in. They never checked, they never walked the line, they couldn't see the permit, it was in a different office. So lo and behold, they started that pump I'm referring to, and immediately the gas found the leak path, and within 20 seconds, 30 kilograms of gas had escaped, and boom, first explosion. 6 Cs, all breached. Let me go back to my night. On these installations, what's your first means of escape if something really goes wrong? How would you get off that installation? Anyone care to give me an answer? I could tell you, it's the heliport. Helicopters will come and get you. That's what we understood. There is the helideck, completely engulfed in smoke, unusable, inaccessible. There would be no helicopters coming that night. Secondary means of escape, lifeboats. That glowing, explosive gas cloud happened to be where the lifeboats were. 2 of the lifeboats were completely ruined. The others were inaccessible. We never knew. We were heading for the accommodation. We had no idea what had just happened. As we stood on the drill floor, I watched my driller panic as he lost control of the drilling equipment. There was no alarms, no electrical power, nothing. It all failed at the same time. Those traveling equipment, heavy equipment, were hurtling towards the floor. He managed to stop them and he saved our lives. And then we had to decide what we did next. We decided we'd head for the accommodation, our muster point. What did that look like? I could tell you, you can see from the picture. There was no daylight almost where we were. It was thick, black, acrid smoke. You could not see this much in front of you. So we made a human chain, 8 of us. We took hold of our collar, one in front of the other, and we headed for the accommodation. This was our route. We went through the devastation. We went through the inferno, and we arrived at the accommodation. And as we approached the accommodation, I was at the back of the line of 8 people. And as you see, I'm quite tall. And the door in front of us was swinging wide open. That was the door into the accommodation, our safe haven. That door, that very door, had been broken since the day I arrived on Piper on April that year. And I hadn't reported it, and nor had anyone else. And that door was the main door to the accommodation that was used every day by most people. Complacency. Absolute complacency on board that installation. When we arrived there, and I looked at the door, I decided I cannot go in there. It's the wrong thing to do. It didn't feel right in here. Call it a sense of knowing. So I decided to let go the collar of my friend, my colleague, and I watched them disappear into the accommodation. All 8 of them. And I stood there thinking, what am I going to do? I had no idea. I didn't know Piper. I decided I'd go back to the drill floor. Believe it or not, I returned the same way as I'd left, on my own, unable to see, unable to breathe until I got to the drill floor. I arrived there and I met my colleague Vince. Vince knew Piper very well, and he would be my escape ticket. We decided we had to get as close to the water as we could, because that was the only way we were going to be saved that night. We travelled across the platform. We went down to the 70-foot level, and we were inside the walls. We had no access to the outside world yet. And Vince found a hatch on the floor. He lifted it, and we went down. And we stood on that hatch, just like I'm standing on the edge of the stairs with a handrail, thinking, what a choice. We either jump or we burn, 70 feet above the water. There was a further explosion, and I turned round, and Vince was gone. He'd either been blown off or he'd jumped. I had no idea. And it was my turn. I took my hard hat off, and I put it on the gratings. I kicked off my boots, because I knew they would suck me under. I emptied my pockets, and I prepared to jump. I took a big breath, and I went for it. I hit the water hard. I've no idea how deep I went, but immediately you feel the pressure on your lungs. You feel that sense of urgency to kick your legs to get to the surface. And as I did, I popped back up, and I thought to myself, this is my night. I'm off. I'm going to be okay. How wrong was I? Just As I came to the surface, I looked up, and the whole platform was just an inferno. Explosions, etc., etc. And then the second explosion happened. The tartan riser, that 18-inch pipe full of gas, ruptured right in the heart of the platform. Gas was now being exhausted on the platform and burning profusely. That cloud of gas came sweeping down to the water right towards me. And I thought, it's not my night. I'm done. I went under the water, stayed there for as long as I could, and I came back up, and this is what I saw. The gas had heated, and it had risen very quickly. Again, I had dodged the bullet, and I was thinking, I'm going to be okay. This will be okay. And as I turned round, there was a huge supply ship steaming right towards me. It had only one purpose, to get to that platform to try and put the fire out. It did not see me. I thought I was a goner. I was going under the vessel. Thankfully, they had seen me jump. They'd seen Vince jump. And they came to rescue us. I had hypothermia almost by the time they rescued me. I could not use my hands. And yet they threw me a rope and said, hold on to the rope and we'll pull you in. I couldn't hold the rope. I wrapped it around my waist, tucked it under my arms, and was dragged out the water. Once on board, I actually was dragged down to the changing rooms to try and warm me up in the showers. And thankfully, Vince was in the showers. He had already been rescued. That would be my lucky night. I'm not going to go through the 6 C's again, although I could. I'm putting them up on the screen, and you can read the slides afterwards. I'm applying these 6 C's just as I did before. This is why the tartan piper exploded 20 minutes after the first explosion. Not because it wasn't rated. It was rated to last at least an hour and a half. But to be honest, there were some things done that night, common practice on Piper, that did not protect the platform. They had turned the fire pumps to manual, so they didn't come on. Not a drop of fire water was applied to that installation by itself. They had put rubber mats half the size of the stage on the gratings, and all this liquid oil that was escaping was gathering and burning directly under the pipe. It was weakening the pipe, and eventually it ruptured quickly. Those 6 C's were all compromised. The OEMs on the other installations continued to pump gas into Piper for an hour and a half after the first explosion, despite being able to see what was going on. Think about choices, think about consequences. And ultimately, it was the failure of them to stop exporting that made such a big difference. I'm going to share a video about the human cost of Piper. It's only a short video, but I want you to think about this in terms of the 167 men that lost their lives, and think about the grief in that communities and families that continues to this day.
A total of 61 of the personnel of Piper survived the event. Their evidence was heard at the inquiry. In the light of that evidence, it can be seen that they escaped from the platform in the following ways. 27 descended by rope from the 68-foot level to the 20-foot level. 7 climbed down a rope or hose from the 68-foot level or a navigation platform below it and dropped into the sea. 5 jumped off the 68-foot level or the platform just below. 1 jumped off a roof beside the drilling derrick. 15 jumped off at the level of the pipe deck, 131 feet. And 5 jumped off at the level of the heli deck, 175 feet. "16 of the deceased from Piper were recovered from the surface of the sea. 38 were recovered from the seabed. And 81 were recovered from inside the accommodation. 30 persons from Piper remain missing and should be presumed to have died on the 6th of July as a result of the disaster. 2 members of the crew of the Sandhaven's fast rescue craft also died.
"167 lives lost, families affected, colleagues grieving, communities devastated. Every one of those lives is tragic. But the most tragic for me, if there is such a thing, is the 81 in the accommodation. They did what they were supposed to do. They went where they were supposed to go to, except Piper had no resilience. Their emergency recovery plan had never really been tested. They didn't practice. They never did drills. If you were going to do a drill on Piper, an emergency drill, it would be on a Sunday at 4 o'clock if the weather was nice. Do you think that prepares you for a disaster? Not at all. The OIM, the installation manager on board, completely broke down in the galley. He did not take command and control. People were waiting for his instruction. His leadership failed. He would tragically lose his life also. There was no resilience on board that platform for emergency recovery. They had all the training. They had all the training you could imagine, but they just hadn't put it into action. Think about competence. Think about complacency. Think about safety-critical communications. Think about control of work. These things were all failing right in front of their eyes. Those 81 people sat waiting. None of them died of burns. They all died of smoke inhalation. They waited for instruction. Leadership is so important. Psychological safety is so important. To ask questions, to push the buttons, to be challenging. It just never happened. By morning time, this was all that was left. A burning ruin. A third of the platform left. The gas still burning from the pipes. I watched as I sat on board my rescue vessel as that platform slowly disintegrated, groaning and moaning as it melted into the sea, like it was in slow motion. And I knew at that time there weren't many people off. There weren't many people coming home. It was a terrible, terrible thing to see. Lord Cullen did the full inquiry into the Piper disaster. And his 2 remits were, how do we prevent this happening again? And what do we learn and change to make it better? This is part of it, sharing stories, sharing lessons. I'm going to show a very short video of Lord Cullen summing up Occidental's management's commitment to safety and how they went about managing safety on that platform where 167 people died.
In my considered opinion, Occidental can have been in no doubt as to the grave consequences for the platform and its personnel in the event of a prolonged high-pressure gas fire. A memo dated the 18th of March 1988 stated that structural integrity could be lost within 10 to 15 minutes if a fire was fed from a large pressurized hydrocarbon inventory. A property loss prevention report to Occidental dated the 14th of October 1986 commented on the pipelines to and from the platform. Further, in 1987, Occidental's Loss Prevention Department prepared a preliminary report which described various scenarios which could weaken the platform's structural steel support members and the means of firefighting in each case. One of these was an oil or gas riser rupture. In the case of a rupture on the pipeline side of the emergency shutdown valve, the ESV, no direct action could be taken on the platform to stem the flow of hydrocarbon. These passages, from reports to Occidental themselves, could be used to describe what happened in the disaster.
I will summarize that for you because there's a lot of technical information in there. Effectively, what Lord Cullen was saying was Occidental had had warning signs, big warning signs that something wasn't right and that their asset was vulnerable. Just the year before, months before, a young, and I'm going to impress, a young loss adjuster had been given the task of going out to inspect the platform, one of Occidental's own loss adjusters. And his responsibility was to create a report on the vulnerability and where it stood on that platform. That was a young, enthusiastic engineer who prepared a fantastic report that Lord Cullen makes reference to. In that report was effectively described what was about to happen a year later. And he handed it to management onshore. Think about management commitment. Their approach was, and I kid you not, this was their approach. It was in the inquiry, giving us evidence. It was a great report, but he was a young engineer. He was over-enthusiastic. He didn't really understand how Piper worked. Give him a couple of months, and he'll soon fit in. He just sees things worst-case scenario. And they did nothing with the report. My message to you as employers, leaders, supervisors, take what your young engineers take to you as serious. If they are courageous enough, and it takes an immense amount of courage to challenge your elders and your superiors, if they're brave enough to do that, at least give them the time of day and consider what they ask of you. And I've learned, and I'll explain why, I've learned through my years as a manager that it's not necessarily what you say, but the body language you give off. And that may be enough to turn some people off from raising their hand, and their choices would be, I can't approach him. He's not approachable. As a leader, it's so important that you create a psychological safety approach. I recall one story. I was in Brazil. I'm a big Scottish guy. Brazilians are quite short. They don't understand the language. I sound aggressive. I stride big. I'd been down there for 3 months running an operation with about 30 Brazilians in my office. I tried my best to be accommodating and easy and empathetic. But I found out 3 months later that they found me as immensely scary. I would stride up and down the office. My voice was loud. I was tall. They just couldn't approach me. And when I found out, I was devastated because I was trying my best. And then I learned to tone down my approach. I changed some of my behaviors to allow them to feel comfortable enough to approach me. It's not difficult, but it takes effort. Take that as a lesson. I have 2 more slides, and they're pretty simple. I want you to think about this every day, because you'll make lots of choices every day. Some of them will be repeat choices. There'll be choices you've made before. But what's changed at the other end? Do you really know? Probably not. So when you've got your head full of bias and full of things to do, and you're bombarded with questions that you have to make choices about, sometimes you should just push your chair back, find space, find your inner self, de-stress. Think about the right choices, because your choices have consequences that you have no control over. Make your choices like the lives of your own loved ones, your children, your colleagues, your family. Depend upon them, and you will make your choices differently. I'm open for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very